Mum, Aunt Trish,
Fort Washington.
welcome to Fort Washington. What's up, my Unexplainables, and welcome back to yet another unexplainable adventure. Now, in today's video, I have surprised my mum and my auntie at probably one of the most exciting places in America. Well, in Washington anyway. We have come all the way to Fort Washington. Yes, you've seen this place on my channel before, but my mum and my auntie have never been to such an amazing place before because, well, apart from Britain, because you know, Britain's pretty cool and full of history, you know. So I thought I'd bring them here because I know they really like it. There's lots of abandoned stuff and there's really big hills that I'm probably going to roll my mum down. So let's see what happens. Let's get into that fort. Hey, Mum, what do you think so far?
Oh, it's lovely.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you want to live here?
This is beautiful. Look at that view.
It's absolutely stunning.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, Mum, who are we locking in the dungeon today?
Aunt Trish.
Okay.
No.
Now, guys, don't forget, I have previously come here to the fort where I did do a much more in-depth look at everything around. So this video here is going to be more of your historical telling information type video. But if you want to see much more behind the scenes and out of bounds areas, then I will leave the link to my previous video up here and also at the end of the video as well.
So this is going to be space for two officers. The officers themselves are going to actually sleep upstairs with their wives and families. Upstairs, you've got a room in the front and a smaller room in the back, and that's duplicated on both sides of this hallway. I think they probably shared this floor. So this side here is set up as both a bedroom and a living space because we're not allowed to go upstairs to show you what that would look like. But this would probably be the parlor room. It's where the officers would have entertained. So if they have a dinner party or something, they're going to be in here. You can see like they've got a checkers board, an officer's desk for paperwork, things like that, and then various other things that you would have probably more often in a bedroom. The officers would have dined in here. The kitchen would have been downstairs in the basement. Remember, they're cooking over open fires. It's going to be a little bit dirtier. So that stuff is down out of the way. Officers tried to maintain a middle-class lifestyle, which would have meant that you would have had at least one servant. In the Victorian period, that's kind of what indicated that you were a middle-class person, was when you had a servant. The servants probably would have slept in the basement as well. And then there's another room back here on the left. It's currently the bathroom, so you probably don't want to film that. I don't know what that room would have been, maybe a pantry. They would have brought the food up and stuck it in the pantry and then brought it into the dining room during meals. The transoms are supposed to let extra light in because, remember, we're pre-electricity. We're too far away from a city to have gas. We would have had oil lamps. So you see up here, that's kind of what an oil lamp from the period would have looked like. Of course, that is an electric light designed to look like an oil lamp, but you kind of get the gist. They also would have used a lot of candles. Nice high ceilings to make it cooler during the day. Because remember, we're in Maryland, which is basically the South. Just maybe a few decades prior, this was a hazardous duty post for British ambassadors because it was a swamp. So it was a very humid climate back then. It's been cleaned up a little bit. It's still humid, but there's not the mosquito problem that they would have had in the 19th century.
Okay.
If you see up top, so if you go, you can go up there and look in the window. That was the commandant's office. He would have conducted the business of the fort from that office. The bottom floor on both sides are the guard quarters. So as the officer of the day, I'm running that. I would have done that from an office on the other side of the fort guardhouse. So this side's the commandant's office, the other side is the officer of the day's office. And it also doubles as the quartermaster's office. So we kind of share because the quartermaster is going to be responsible for bringing in the supplies and things like that, food, ordnance, all that kind of good stuff. And that kind of requires an office all its own. But the soldiers of the guard post, or the guard detail, excuse me, would have been on the first floor here on both sides. The side closest to us was used for sleeping. So the soldiers who were on the guard detail but not actually standing guard at the time would have kind of that place to relax, to have meals, to take a nap, because a guard detail was 24 hours. So you show up at 8 o'clock in the morning for your guard detail, you change the guard out, and then you are actually only standing guard for 2 hours at a time. And then, so it's 2 hours on and then like 4 hours off. So you're doing a rotation. And then at the end of that day, you go back to being a regular soldier until it's your turn to be on guard detail again. The far side is going to be where the actual guard stuff happens. So we've got hooks on the walls for soldiers to put their accoutrements, so their cartridge boxes, their belts, haversacks and canteens, so that when they're just off duty, they can just put that stuff up there. And then when the guard is called out for, oh no, we're being attacked, or there's some kind of a thing that we need to respond to, they can quick grab the stuff, slap it on, and run out the door. You've got your musket rack, so you can stash your musket there while you're taking a nap or eating meals or whatever. You've got the table to sit at for playing cards, eating meals, just talking to each other, whatever it is. And then you've got a nice bed that you can take a nap on when you're not actually doing guard work, but you're still in the guard. So they would have had straw pallets on those beds. A bed this size, you notice it's fairly wide. Yeah. That might have had 4 people sleeping in it. So you'd sleep head to foot for a little bit more room. People didn't have the same concept of personal space at the time that we have today. So you hear stories about like President Lincoln sharing a bed with a fellow person when they were riding the circuit as part of when he was a lawyer. That was to share money, to save space, because they don't have hotels the way they do now. Hotels are smaller, the rooms are smaller, there's just not as much room. So sharing beds was a common thing. It wasn't like, there wasn't any sexual kind of component about it back then. So this probably would have slept up to 4 soldiers at once. I'm actually a little heavy for a Civil War soldier. I weigh about 140 pounds. An average Civil War soldier was between 120 and 135. I'm 5'6". I'm 5'7", so just a little bit taller, a little bit heavier. You weren't technically authorized to join the Army until you were 18, unless you were a musician. Musicians were enlisted as low as 12. Drummers, fifers, buglers, right? But a lot of soldiers, especially in the volunteer service, would get around that because the officers who were recruiting for the volunteer units weren't really picky. They just wanted to have enough people that they could be an officer. So people who wanted to serve but were not 18 would write 18 on a slip of paper, put it in their shoe, and they could truthfully say, I'm over 18. It doesn't matter if you're responding to a question, how old are you? If you don't say, I'm 18 years old, but I'm over 18, you're physically not lying to the person. So they interpret the answer one way when you meant it a different way. It's a sneaky way of not lying because they were really big on being more truthful back then, I guess. So this side is where the soldiers would have performed guard duty. You've got holding cells, and these are really more like drunk tanks than jail cells. During the time period around the Civil War, most of the punishments were physical style punishments, not incarceratory style punishments. So things like you have to run in a circle holding a backpack over your head, Or you have to ride a sawhorse for a long period of time where your feet can't touch the ground. So you're basically getting a lot of pain in your groin area. Or they tied people to wagon wheels and other stuff like that. Lashing and other corporal punishment was not allowed, but physical punishment was absolutely a thing back then. So if you didn't polish your buttons enough, or you did something wrong that wasn't like a really big crime, you're probably going to have some kind of, you wear a sign that says you're a drunk or whatever, embarrass yourself somehow, or are physically inconvenienced in some way. This is going to be for people who, they are brought in for something that might be a little bit more serious, and they need to be held until an officer can deal with them, or until the ferry shows up and can take them up to Washington, D.C. So it's really temporary, and if you look inside, it's a fairly small area. This is the bigger of the two cells. This cell also has a fireplace, so this is the one that if they were going to be in it for a little while, they would put them in here. The other one is for a very short period of time, or if this one was full. This is for a very short period of time, so it's unlikely that you'd have a large number of people in here. This wasn't used as a prison camp. These would have been for very short-term imprisonments and not for anything long-term. Right. There would have been a disciplinary barracks, or they would have been, like this is the small one. You can see how it's kind of like the walls are wet. It's kind of dank. It really gives you that kind of 18th century British prison vibe.
Dungeon. Yeah, being locked up in the dungeons of London.
Again, this is really just to hold people until they can be dealt with, not for serving a sentence. Okay. So they're not going to be convicted and held here. This is for temporary, but only for or for drying out. Like if you're drunk and you come back and you stumble in, the guard's going to snag you and bring you in here and say, hey, dry out, rummy. They would hold you here until the ferry showed up and they could take you up back to Washington, D.C. for actual punishment. These casemates were originally designed to hold artillery pieces like the one over there, but the way that they weren't designed well. So when they installed one gun and fired it for a test purpose, it didn't vent the smoke out properly. So basically the cannon fired and it recoiled back into the casemate, and the entire casemate filled with choking smoke, and they're like, this isn't gonna work. So they disinstalled the one gun, they never installed any others, and they only ever installed cannons on the top of the walls. These were then used for a variety of purposes. Some of them were where the laundresses lived with their husbands. Some of them were used as a sutler's post. So the sutler's post during the Civil War period would be equivalent to a commissary or PX, like a British canteen, I guess. So it would be a guy who was authorized by the commander of the unit to sell personal items and more exotic foods to the soldiers of the unit. And he was then given a casemate that he could sell that material out of. And it would allow people to buy things like knit caps or scarves or gloves or shirts. Like if you want to have a civilian shirt, right, you could get that, or different shoes or canned foods, candies, stuff like that, tobacco, rum for officers or other alcoholic beverages for officers, that sort of thing. Some of them were used as the post hospital for a while, so they would have had those, and then they were also used as storerooms, just general storage facilities. Right. When the fort was not occupied by soldiers, most of the cannons were disassembled, and the wood part of the carriages is the wooden part of the cannon, and then the barrel is the metal part. Right. The wooden part, so the carriages of cannons, would be stored down in the storerooms, and that way it prevents it from rotting. And then when it's time for the soldiers to come back and reoccupy the fort, they pull out the carriages, they reassemble them, and then they mount the barrels onto the carriage, and the cannons are good to go. For the majority of the fort's existence as an active post, it was only occupied by one soldier. That would be the ordnance sergeant, and he would have lived in the yellow house out there, which is usually the commander's house. But because there wasn't anybody stationed here, he gets to live there. And so for vast portions of the fort's period when it was actually used as a fort, it was basically closed up, and the ordnance sergeant would like unlock it every day, come in, look around, make sure everything was good to go, note any repairs that needed to be made so that he could contract that out to local repair people, that sort of thing. And then he'd close the fort back up, go back to his house, and do whatever it is he did for the rest of the day. So the rest of the fort, you've got a powder magazine on each side. So the Park Service actually uses this one as an active powder magazine so that when we do our demonstrations, because we fire the cannons here first Sunday of the month from April to October. So they have to have black powder on hand for us to shoot, store it in there. The other one, though, is open. It is in very poor condition because the Park Service doesn't have enough money to maintain everything to the condition that they would like. But it's open. You can look into it to kind of see how big it is on the inside. Also, you've got down the hole, there's a hole there next to that sign. That leads to the Capiniere, which is the rear defensive position. So this fort is primarily designed to defend against seaborne attack, so people sailing up the river. But what happened last time during the War of 1812 was the British show up on the river, they shoot some cannons at the fort shoots a couple cannons back, the British Navy falls back, they basically put one guy ashore, he rides his horse around up to Washington, D.C., where the British Army has captured Washington, D.C., and they're like, hey, send some guys down to capture this fort. And the commander of the fort, he basically sees the British coming from the north. He sees the British fleet out there. He's like, I don't want to die today. So he blows up the fort and runs away. He ended up getting court-martialed. Okay. But then they realized that fort wasn't very well sited because that fort was down the hill right by the water. So they hire Pierre L'Enfant, who was the guy who laid out Washington, D.C. a few years earlier, to redesign the fort. They bought new land further back up the hill so that it has a better field of fire, but they're still worried about people coming around behind. And so they add the Capiniere on in the 1830s or 40s, and the sign should be able to tell you when exactly it was added on. The whole point of that is to basically cover the back of the fort so that if bad guys come up the hill from behind, they can't just run over the walls. A couple of things, I guess. Are you familiar with the TV show The Terror?
No.
I think it was on Hulu or Netflix. It's a kind of Britishy production. It's got Ciarán Hinds in it. It's got a couple other pretty well-known British actors who I don't recall off the top of my head. Anyway, it's about the Franklin expedition, which was a polar expedition to look for the Northwest Passage in Canada. It was in the 1840s. The ships sailed and got lost in 1845, I think. The ship that the show is named after, HMS Terror, was the ship that bombarded Fort Warburton during the War of 1812. Because it was originally built as a bomb vessel, it bombarded Fort McHenry, it bombarded here, and then because it had such a very strong hull, they're like, this bomb vessel would be great for Arctic expeditions because it can deal with the Arctic ice better. So they converted it into an exploration vessel, and now it's underwater in Canada somewhere. So if you watch that show, just know that the main ship in that show was here on the Potomac bombarding the fort in 1814. After the Civil War, the fort was abandoned in 1872. They just kind of locked the door up and said, we're going to a different fort because they were ordered to go, and they just didn't use it anymore. The soldiers who were stationed here were ordered to Fort Devon, Massachusetts, and they were ordered to abandon the fort. So they locked the door, dropped the key off with the War Department on their way out, and marched all the way up to Massachusetts from here. In the 1880s, the Secretary of War, a guy named Endicott, determined that cannons like were used in the Civil War were not going to stop battleships. So if Britain or Germany or France decided they were going to come bombard Washington, D.C. with a battleship in the 1880s or 90s, those cannons weren't going to work. So we needed to reinvest in our defenses. And on your way in, you probably saw a giant concrete structure, a ruin. That's what we call an Endicott battery. And there were a large number of them here. The largest one was Battery Meigs, which is back by where the entrance to the fort is. It consisted of 8 12-inch mortars. The Battery Emery, which is the one right outside here, was 2 10-inch rifles. The one that is now in the water battery, which is where Fort Warburton used to be, those were 2 6-pounder rifles. And their job was to stop torpedo boats. Construction started on those batteries here in about 1895. By the Spanish-American War, they were fully manned, ready to, well, the ones that were completed were manned and ready to defend Washington. All of them were completed by 1910, but they were pretty rapidly obsolete. They were all removed in 1921 after World War I. So from the Spanish-American War through World War I, this was an active defensive post again, but this portion of the fort, the brick portion, was not used. It was just the Endicott batteries. This was just store space, stuff like that. After the defenses were removed, it was just a barracks space, basically. And I'm talking about the whole fort at this point, not just the brick portion. So from 1921 to 1939, this was the home of the ceremonial units of the United States Army. They'd be trucked up to Washington, D.C. to perform their ceremonial duties and trucked back here, because this was the closest permanent post at that time. About 1939, the Arlington Cantonment area was created. Today, that's Fort Myers, and the ceremonial units were moved up there. At that point, late 1939, early 1940, the War Department's like, we don't need this anymore, it's surplus to requirements. They donated the location, to the Department of the Interior to turn into a national park. And then a couple months later, this thing called Pearl Harbor happened. The day after Pearl Harbor, so Monday, December 8th, the War Department is on the phone to the Department of the Interior saying, we want our fort back. And by January of 1942, this fort was the home of the Adjutant General School, which is human resources for the Army. And this post trained all the adjutant general officers that were inducted into the Army from January of 1942 to August of 1944 when the Adjutant General School moved. So it ran an officer candidate school that trained people who had never been in the Army before how to be officers in the Adjutant General branch. It had an Adjutant General school that trained officers who were commissioned already through like either West Point or another officer commissioning source like ROTC. So they were already officers. 6 weeks, they turned out an Adjutant General officer. And then there was a 3rd battalion that trained officers and enlisted people how to use computers. The Adjutant General Department was the first branch of the United States Army to use electromechanical accounting machines, which is an electromechanical computer. They had partnered with IBM in 1940 to design a bus filled with an electromechanical computer to process personnel records and reports. And then they could transmit those using a teletype machine, using underwater cables. So using this special computer, they could tabulate all of the unit returns for personnel and transmit them to the United States. And within 48 hours from the time that the report was created, an officer in the Pentagon could be reading, we need this many people at this location, to replace the people who were casualties. And so that was one of the real watershed moments for the Army. And those first computer soldiers were trained here. After the fort was abandoned by the Adjutant General School, so August of 44, until the fort was finally turned back over to the Department of the Interior in 1946, the only real use was the hospital here on post. It was basically used as a place for soldiers who had been wounded overseas, who lived in the D.C. area, especially in the southern Maryland / Northern Virginia area, would be put in this hospital so their families could come visit them and help in their recovery. And then once they were to a point where they could be safely discharged from the hospital, they would either be sent somewhere else for military service, or if they were no longer capable of military service, they would be medically discharged. So this was often a last stop for a lot of soldiers from this area during World War II. And then after the war, it was, the last soldiers were sent home. The post was closed down, turned back over to the Department of the Interior. They tore down 90% of the buildings outside of the brick portion of the fort. So you'll notice that there is a dilapidated building with some pillars in front of it, out by a flagpole, that was post headquarters from like 1890 until 1946. And then there is one officer quarters that it just looks like a farmhouse next to it. And that was an officer's quarters from the time of the Endicott system through to the time that the fort was finally turned over to the Department of the Interior for good.
Baking company, army bread.
So these boxes as well would have been the actual boxes that were delivered here to the fort.
Small Maryland.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, that's their beds.
Yeah, that's a bed there. Sturdy. Go on, go and have a lay down.
I'm not getting in it.
Go on.
No, I'll go through it.
No, you'll be all right.
No laughing at me then.
Watch it break. No, it's going to break. No, it's bending. It's actually bending. Do you know how old that is, Mum? Get off it. What are you doing? Hey, Mr. Civil War man. So just telling Mum about the drunk tanks and how all the naughty soldiers would get locked in here. And now she is, not getting locked in. Get in there at the back. Go and make a fire. Go on. You've been naughty. You look tiny in there. You are now locked in jail. State your case and argue your plea. What?
I didn't mean to do it. I want to come home, please.
Tell me that I'm your favourite and I'll let you out.
But I love all my children.
No. You have to state, my baby girl, Chantel, is my favourite child.
My baby girl, Chantal, is my favourite girl child.
Okay, I'll let you off. Out you come. Okay, so that was the biggest one, Mum. Now go take a look in the next.
Oh, crikey.
I know, right? Oh, that's tiny.
Oh, no, don't like this one.
How do you feel in there?
Claustrophobic.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said.
Oh, no, I don't like this one. Give
Ooh,
me heebie-jeebs.
Gives you...
Get in.
Oh, God, no. God, no. She literally just pushed me down the stairs. Help! Oh, okay, let's get out.
Penelope pit stop.
Do you know, as soon as I walked in there, that's what I said. I felt very claustrophobic. You are staying in there forever. Bye. Bye. All right, Mum, Auntie Trish, what do you think of your day at Washington Fort?
It's lovely.
Yep. Did you get stuck in any dungeons?
Yes.
You did. Did you
locked
get
in.
stuck or pushed forcefully in one?
Pushed.
You got pushed. We let you out though, so we were nice
No,
to
actually,
you.
you didn't. You
Oh.
ran away and left me now. I had to open the door myself. Thank you very much.
Okay, that is a true story. I did do that. But you are lucky because I didn't find a massive hill and roll you down it. So that you got away lightly.
There's one there.
Get up that hill, let me push you down it. So we've had an absolutely amazing time here at Washington Fort.
So as we walk up over the hill, right, off to the left side, you're gonna see a spot
Okay.
that looks like it's a road, but it's grass.
Okay.
That used to be a road, but they covered it up. As you go down that road a little ways, kind of off to the left, you'll see a couple of buildings that were built as part of the fire direction system for the Endicott batteries. They're abandoned. You said you like abandoned stuff.
I love abandoned stuff.
So it'll take about 2 seconds. They're like 50 feet off the road.
Oh, great.
Well, this video has not ended yet, my unexplainables. Our war heroes over here, look, are now taking us to some abandoned places. But guys, as I was saying, do not forget that I do previously have a video on this beautiful fort. So if you do want to see more of the buildings and the surroundings and, of course, the out of bounds areas, then make sure you head on over and watch that video so you can see and experience experience so much more from this beautiful place. But for now, from me, my mum, and me Aunt Trisha, we're going to say goodbye to you all. Don't forget to stay kind, happy and positive everywhere you go. Always tell somebody that you love them. And until the next unexplainable adventure, way out.